die später mal. Massimiliano, which of the microphones do we use? These ones or what, do you know what? No, from this. Where to press?
Prova. Yeah.
Is it? Yeah. Okay. Okay, fine.
We take the microphone because we are recording.
Oh, okay. So, do I also have to take care of the time?
As you prefer.
Massimiliano, but who's going to change the slides?
Yeah.
You?
No.
He himself.
I don't know. I have to ask.
You want to sit here, or?
I think I'll probably talk from here.
Okay. So you're not going to be?
We didn't. I think it's probably best.
Yeah, whatever you like.
Yeah.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I think we can start with a little delay. I'm very pleased and honored to present you this afternoon Professor Colin Mayer from the Side Business School at Oxford University, where is the Peter Moores Professor of Management Studies. We've met quite a couple of times at conferences, but I just learned that he never came to Lugano, actually, not for professional reasons, not in private. And then even more happy are we to have him here today. To most, I probably do not have to present him a lot because he's very well known. He has a couple of very important merits and appointments at Oxford University, where he spent most of his academic life, starting with the Bachelor in Engineering and finishing with the Doctor of Philosophy in Finance. He has also a lot of appointments at other very prestigious universities, has been Harkness Fellow at Harvard University, has been at Stanford, MIT, and Columbia, to just name a few of his visiting appointments. And he is a fellow of the British Academy. He is a co-founder, I think, and very involved in the European Corporate Governance Institute, which has also become a very successful institution, and is a member of the Royal Society of Arts. And furthermore, he's also involved a lot in non-academic practical gatherings like being in the UK Competition Appeal Tribunal and the Natural Capital Committee. And besides being one of the most important scholars in finance and corporations, he also has a lot of professional experience being the first chairman of Oxera from 1986 and 2010, a large independent consulting firm, and now a director of Aurora Energy Research Limited. So I will not go through the merits in his publication list, but Colin has published a lot on corporate finance and on corporate governance in particular, also on development economics. And today he will talk about the role of the corporation in society, or better said, the changing role of the corporation in society. And I think that's also similar to a title of a recent book that he's going to present. So Colin, we're really looking forward to having you here and listening to your talk. And again, welcome. Benvenuto a Lugano.
Eric, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. My father, if he was alive today, would have appreciated it, and my mother might have believed it. Because, as Woody Allen said, since light travels faster than sound, people appear bright until you hear them speak. Well, I'm extremely grateful to the organizers for having invited me here today for this spectacular conference on a remarkable day, and it is indeed my first visit to Lugano, and it's going to be a very memorable first visit to Lugano. Hesiod had 4 of them, Ovid 5, Shakespeare 7. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages, the 7 ages of men. At first the infant, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms, and then the whining schoolboy, with satchel and shining morning face, creeping like snail unwillingly to school. All very politically incorrect. Much safer to stick to the corporation. There we find 6 ages. At first, the merchant trading company, undertaking voyages of discovery and opening up trading around the world. Then the public corporation, building railways and canals. The third age is the private corporation and the seedbeds of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of manufacturing industry. The fourth age is the service firm and the growth of financial services. Then comes the transnational corporation, putting a girdle around the earth and running rings around nations. Last scene of all that ends this strange, eventful history is the mindful corporation. Sans men, sans money, sans machines, sans everything. Take a look at this. It shows the proportion of companies on the S&P index that have intangible and tangible assets. Tangible assets such as plant, machinery, and buildings. Intangible assets such as brands, patents, and research and development. It shows that 40 years ago, intangible assets accounted for just 20% of the value of companies on the S&P index. Today, it accounts for 80%, or probably getting on now for around about 85% of the value of the S&P index. And have a look at this. It shows investment in intangible assets and tangible assets in the UK. And it shows that the millennium was a turning point at which investment in intangibles for the first time equaled that in tangible assets, and since then has powered ahead. And look at that period in blue, the financial blues, the financial crisis. And you can see that if anything, investment in intangibles was more resilient than that in tangibles. We might once have been a nation of buildings and office blocks, lots of office blocks, but now we're a nation of brands and brains. But anything we do, of course, the US does bigger and better. There too, we see that the millennium was a turning point when investment in intangibles equaled investment in tangibles and powered ahead. But their investment in intangibles accounts for around about 9% of GDP, as against about 6% in the UK. And if you pose the question, well, what is the significance of this? Flaky is what I can hear many of you said. We used to have economies based on machines and man, but now it's just minds and magicians. The weightless economy based on air. Not so, I would suggest. The mindful corporation is a remarkable development. And take a look at this example. Facebook and the mind behind it, Mark Zuckerberg. In 2008, Mark Zuckerberg made a rather costly mistake when he decided not to hire 2 people who just left Yahoo. Failing to get employment, they went and sat in this place here, the Red Rock Cafe in Mountain View, with computers on tables, writing code for sending MMS and SMS messages. Then, in 2009, they raised $250,000 from their former Yahoo colleagues. And last year, they sold their endeavors to Facebook for $19 billion. The 2 people were Brian Acton and Yang Koum, and the company was WhatsApp. Had Mark Zuckerberg employed these 2 people in 2008, he could have done so for a few $1,000s, but instead he had to purchase their corporate form for $19 billion. And what makes this story even more remarkable is that in the 6 months up to that purchase by Facebook, WhatsApp was making a loss of $230 million. Not only was it sans money, it was burning money. What did Mark Zuckerberg think he was doing? Was he mad or a magician? The mindful corporation is very different from its predecessors, from the trading companies with their fleets of ships, or the public corporations building the railways and canals with their hordes of labourers, or the manufacturing firms with their belching factories, or the service firms with their smart service providers, or the financial transnational corporations with their gleaming global headquarters. The mindful corporation is just this. It's a mind. And because it sans everything, it crystallizes both the wonders and the woes of the modern corporation. Take this example. On August the 19th, 2004, Google came to the NASDAQ stock market in New York at an issue price of $85, which valued the company at some $23 billion. The founders, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, are today each worth $30 billion. But it's not just the concentration of wealth that's associated with these companies that is staggering, but there's also a very high concentration of control and power. Because while Larry Page and Sergey Brin have sold a majority of the shares in Google, they've retained control through having the voting rights in the company, through the dual-class share structure that Google has. Now, some people argue that that type of dual-class share structure is bad governance and to the detriment of other shareholders. But I don't think we have to shed too many tears for the shareholders in Google who purchased their shares at $85, when today those shares are worth $530, more than a six-fold increase over a period during which the stock market as a whole has just doubled in value. No, we don't have to shed too many tears for them, or indeed the shareholders in Facebook, where Mark Zuckerberg has retained control, or in LinkedIn, where Reid Hoffman has retained control, because in each case the shareholders have done quite nicely, thank you. No, it's not so much the shareholders as us, the rest of society, that might be concerned about the impact of those concentrations of both wealth and control. The mindful corporation in this respect is very different from the merchant trading companies and the public corporations, which operated by license from the monarch or by parliament, or indeed the private family companies that were very dependent on their nation states. No, it's with the emergence of the transnational corporation that corporations have become very footloose and not dependent on any particular nation state. And it's not just that they're footloose, they've become increasingly timeless. The licenses and charters associated with the merchant trading companies would frequently exist for several decades, or in the case of the East Indies Company, for a matter of centuries. Family companies would hold their companies through several generations. It was essentially with the rise of the financial service firm and the holding by institutions that shareholdings have become progressively shorter term in nature, and that has continued to this day on stock markets all around the world with declining holding periods by institutional investors. Now, the significance of this is not just restricted by any means to just the developed world. Indeed, in many respects, the most interesting feature of the corporation is the extent to which it may explain differences in macroeconomic performance around the world. Indeed, for example, the absence of large indigenous corporations in the Middle East and in Africa goes a long way towards explaining the relatively low levels of internal economic development in those countries and many of the political and social problems that exist there. The absence of large indigenous corporations, excluding those in the mineral resource extractive industries, contrast with the quite large number of subsidiaries of overseas corporations. But in particular, it contrasts with the contribution that corporations have made to, for example, the remarkable growth of the Chinese economy, where state-owned corporations and then private corporations have been the backbone of the growth of the Chinese economy. So too have bank-owned corporations in Japan during the high growth era, and family-owned companies in Korea, Singapore, and in India. But at the same time, associated with those corporations have been many problems. In the case of the Chinese corporations, environmental problems and corruption. In the case of Japan, the incestuous relationships between banks and corporations giving rise to the collapse of the banking system during the 1990s and the lost decade. And in the case of the Chaebol families in Korea, the conflicts that exist between the families and society. And closer to home, we have increasing concerns about disparities of income that exist between those at the top of corporations and those on the shop floor, about the failure of corporations to uphold the interest of their customers, in particular in banks, and the failure of them to pay their fair due of taxes to the rest of society. It is remarkable that one institution can explain so much of the difference in performance of economies around the world, in terms of the social contribution, in terms of the development of social networks, and at the same time, a lot of the social divisions that exist in countries. And one institution can explain so much of the environmental problems that we've got and the potential solutions we've got to those environmental problems. It is remarkable that one institution can be a sole enterprise, a corner shop, a large conglomerate enterprise, a social enterprise, a manufacturing firm, a public infrastructure company, a no-tech, a low-tech, or a high-tech company. And it may well be the case that with the freedom from excessive control by governments, that corporations will be able to exploit the technological opportunities that exist even more in the future to our benefit than has been the case in the past. But at the same time, it is perfectly conceivable that the political and social problems and the environmental degradation associated with the corporation may reach a breaking point. We are, in essence, balanced between creation and cataclysm, and we could be heading either to a state of nirvana or to an exploding supernova state. And to ensure that we reach the nirvana rather than the supernova state, we have to think seriously about how to reinvent the corporation for the 21st century. But before I tell you how to reinvent the corporation, what I need to do is to say a little bit about how we invented it in the first place. You'll be relieved to know that the intellectual history of the corporation is relatively short, at least in relation to the history of the corporation itself. Of course, it featured very prominently in the Age of Enlightenment, and it was the rockbed of Adam Smith's theory of specialization of labor and the contribution that that makes to economic growth and prosperity. But for him, that came in the form of relatively small companies, pin manufacturers, to take his specific example, and you don't get much smaller than that. And he saw angels as dancing as directors on the heads of those pin manufacturers. But larger corporations he saw as being infested with conflicts of interest, to a point that negligence and profusion must necessarily prevail more or less in the management of the affairs of such a company. No, it wasn't from large corporations that the benefits associated with economic prosperity were derived, but markets and trades between relatively small companies. And that view prevailed through much of the 19th century as well. Even Alfred Marshall, the father of industrial economics, saw corporations as existing solely because of the integrity and honesty of those who ran those corporations. And he said, it's a strong proof of the marvelous growth in recent times of a spirit of honesty and uprightness in commercial matters that the leading officers of the great companies yield as little as they do to the vast temptations of fraud that lie in their way. Vast temptations of fraud. It was basically only because directors of corporations played cricket and abided by the rules of cricket that they existed, and they did not engage in match fixing. Well, that's hardly much of a theory on which to base the corporation. And it's not until essentially we get to the 1930s and Ronald Coase's notion that the costs of transacting in the firm may be less than those of transacting in the market, that we arrive at a substantive theory of the large corporation. Once you think of it in those terms, the relatively low costs of transacting in the firm relative to those in the market, you provide a rationale for the study of the operations of firms, of the management, of the marketing of companies. In other words, you provide the basis for the scholarship and teaching that has gone on in business schools ever since. But that raises the question then as to who will ensure that the efficiencies within the corporation are greater than those in the market? Well, the answer that naturally emerged was, it is those who bear the risks and rewards of the corporation who should have the rights of ensuring that corporations are run efficiently, namely the shareholders. And so the notion of shareholders having primacy over the corporation emerged as a fundamental concept in the governance of corporations. But then the question arose as to, well, if you give them the rights, are we sure that they will actually exercise the rights? And the answer that emerged in relation to families and the founders of corporations was yes. They had a real interest in ensuring that corporations were run efficiently on their behalf. But in the case of the massed armies of small and institutional shareholders, the answer was no. And if you can't rely on men to manage companies, then you have to turn to markets. So what emerged was the notion that, well, we need markets, not only in products and services, but also in the control of companies to ensure that they are run efficiently on behalf of dispersed shareholders. And so we provided a rationale for the emergence of markets for corporate control and the takeover market. But then people became disillusioned with that and realized that actually the costs associated with those takeover markets were high, and the performance of those acquisitions was often very disappointing. And so instead what emerged was the notion that, well, there are other ways in which one can have markets by which investors, and in particular institutional investors, buy blocks of shares and don't necessarily take over the entire company. And so a rationale was provided for the emergence of hedge fund activism. And quite recently, The Economist described these hedge funds as being capitalism's unlikely heroes. They were the people that were going to shake up and shake out the management of failing corporations. So the combination of markets and goods and services and markets and the control of corporations were the ways of essentially ensuring efficiency in companies and would bring us to this state of nirvana. Well, if this is nirvana, then I'm the Virgin Mary, and that, for a variety of reasons, is an unlikely proposition. It is fundamentally wrong because the underlying premise behind it is wrong. The underlying premise is that the only parties that bear the risks and rewards of corporations are the shareholders. The rest of us, as customers, employees, suppliers, are protected by commercial contracts or labor contracts, employment contracts, or as society and communities by public laws. So it's only the shareholders who bear residual risks. But I don't think that employees in the slums of Nairobi or in the sweatshops of Bangladesh believe that they are well protected by contracts. Nor actually did the employees in Cadbury's Somerdale plant in England think that they were well protected by contract when Cadbury was taken over by Crafts about 5 years ago. And I don't think that you and I, who invested in banks that went bankrupt and suffered losses either directly or as taxpayers, feel that contracts can be readily enforced in many circumstances. And certainly I do not think that future generations believe that they have much voice, let alone feasible contracts, to protect the natural capital and the environment that they may or may not actually inherit in the future. No, it is not the case that the only parties that bear risks and rewards in corporations are shareholders. We all bear risks and rewards in companies and the vicissitudes of the fortunes of those companies. But the solution to this problem is not the one that is conventionally given of simply saying all you have to do is to transfer the control rights from shareholders to another party. for example, to employees or customers and mutual organizations, or to the voting population in state-owned corporations. That doesn't solve the problem because it just transfers the problem somewhere else. It just means that another party has a particular control right interest that can act against the interests of other parties. That is not to say that diversity of corporate form is not a good thing. It is certainly a good thing to promote plurality in ownership and corporate forms so that those can be linked as closely as possible with the needs of companies. But one doesn't solve that problem because in the process of transferring the control rights to employees or customers, for example, one reduces the incentives for outside investors to provide capital. And so for the most part, mutual organizations are concentrated in relatively low capital-intensive industries such as retailing and wholesaling. And furthermore, it does not solve the intergenerational problem, because those companies are run in the interests of current generations of employees and customers, and frequently that gives rise to conflicts with future generations when, for example, there's a move to demutualize those companies to the benefit of current generations of employees and customers at the expense of future generations. No, the fundamental problem is that the underlying premise that the right model of the firm is to view it as a control instrument is simply not appropriate. We should recognize the fact that what the corporation really is essentially a tremendous commitment device, a way of committing to different parties, and in particular, a mechanism of committing to the purpose of the corporation. The purpose of the corporation in terms of, for example, being the cheapest washing manufacturer, or the most reliable car manufacturer, or the largest social network in the world. Corporations are tremendous vehicles for committing in that way to a purpose, and then committing to the various parties that are required to deliver on that purpose, to the investors, or to the employees, or suppliers, or perhaps all three of them, and to balance together the various commitments that are needed to be given to those various parties to be able to deliver on its purpose. Now, in that context, the separation between ownership and control is an attribute, not a deficiency. It allows management to commit to a broad range of stakeholders and to provide breadth of commitment, and at the same time, shareholders to provide the length and depth of commitment of capital that is required to overcome some of the intergenerational problems. So that the corporation is a tremendous way of providing commitment, provided we realize the subtleties of the ways in which the interactions between different parties, between owners and managers take place, and not simply regarded as being an agency problem when management is not fully aligned with the interests of shareholders. Now, why is it that this fairly obvious point that the objective of a corporation and the structure of a corporation should be primarily aligned with the delivery of its purpose is not a generally accepted proposition? The answer is that it's only comparatively recently that the fundamental problem that has emerged has become so evident. In Adam Smith's time, as I said, he realized that large corporations had serious problems associated with them, but in his time, the large corporations were essentially licensed by Parliament to perform some sort of public function. And in Alfred Marshall's period, he did actually see people of great integrity owning and running companies like the Bournevilles and the Cadburys, the Beechams and the Boots, the Rowntrees and the Mackintosh, the Terrys and the Frys, basically all Quaker companies, and for a variety of reasons, mostly chocolate manufacturers. But what he did see was companies of pretty high integrity, which did have clearly defined purposes and delivered on their purposes. No, it's with the rise of the Footloose and the Timeless Corporation that the problems of the conflict between emphasizing the interests of particular parties, such as shareholders, and the delivery of the purpose of the corporation has really come to the fore. Now, while the corporation is a remarkably flexible instrument, the mind of man is not quite so flexible. And as Alfred Schopenhauer said, all truth goes through 3 stages. First of all, it's ridiculed, then it's violently opposed, and finally, it's accepted as self-evident. Well, currently, we're somewhere between stages 1 and 2, and probably closer to being these notions being ridiculed as against being violently opposed yet. But unfortunately, we cannot wait for the normal process of paradigm shift to occur to get us to stage 3 without risking hitting the supernova state instead of the nirvana state. So before we run out of time, and before I run out of time in this lecture, let me turn quickly to the third and final part of this lecture and tell you how we should reinvent the corporation to make it into a trusted corporation. There are 3 components to reinventing the corporation: purpose, ownership, and governance. The purpose of a corporation is not to produce profits. The purpose of a corporation is to produce things that benefit you and I as customers and communities. And in the process of doing that, the corporation produces profits. But profits are not per se the purpose of the corporation. Anyone who's run successful corporations knows that to be the case. And indeed, that is a feature of the most successful corporations in the world. Some of the most successful corporations in the world are Bertelsmann, the media company, Bosch, the automotive supply company, Carlsberg, the brewery, IKEA, the furniture retailer, Tata, the Indian conglomerate, Velux, the window manufacturer. All of those have one thing in common. They are all owned by industrial foundations. Those foundations give a majority of their profits to charities. But it's not that philanthropic element that I want to emphasize. More significantly, those foundations have boards, and the directors who sit on those boards have one key purpose, and that is to ensure that the corporations below them, such as Bosch and Carlsberg, uphold the values and the purposes as laid down by the founders of those companies. And if they fail to do so, then the directors of those foundations take responsibility for that failure. Now, these corporations, in terms of their performance, have had a performance which in many respects is very much in line with other companies. And in particular, I want to emphasize the fact that these corporations do not underperform other matched companies of similar size in similar industries. They don't underperform, but they don't really overperform either. They perform about the same as other companies of similar sizes in similar sectors. But they differ in one critical respect. They survive. The matched companies, on average, survive for less than 20 years. These industrial foundation companies, on average, survive for more than 60 years, more than 3 times the length of life of the matched equivalent companies. Now, if you pose the question, what is it that these companies do differently? Then one critical element is they recognize the importance of the different capital components in their businesses. They recognize that the capital that they employ is not just financial capital. There are, in essence, 5 forms of capital in addition to financial capital: human capital, intellectual capital, material capital, natural capital, and social capital. Now, the significance of those different types of capital has varied across the different types of corporations in history. In the merchant trading companies and the public corporations, because of the licenses, there was a strong emphasis on social capital. In the manufacturing firms, on material capital. In the service firms, on human capital. In the financial firms, on financial capital. In the mindful corporation, on intellectual capital. Interestingly, one form of capital that has never received much emphasis is natural capital. And so one of the reasons why a lot of our problems today are associated with our environment and the sustainability of our natural capital is that that has never been much of a focus of corporate activity in the past. Now, what these industrial foundation firms do is to recognize that in satisfying the fundamental objective of delivering on the purpose of the company as laid down by the founders, they have to engage those various forms of capital, depending on their activities, to varying extents. And so they measure the extent to which they contribute to, or use, or abuse those different forms of capital, and they reward people within the organization on the basis of the performance of those various different types of capital. Now, the industrial foundation is not by any means the only mechanism by which one can achieve this. And in some respects, one of the most interesting legal developments that has occurred over the past decade is the emergence of the public benefit corporation in the United States. That's now swept across some 28 states in the United States, most significantly of all in Delaware, where most US corporations are incorporated. The public benefit corporation has to specify a public benefit alongside its commercial and financial objectives and purposes. And the directors of those public benefit corporations have a fiduciary responsibility to uphold that public purpose. So it goes beyond a benefit corporation, a B corporation, in making it a legal obligation on the part of the directors of those companies to uphold those public purposes. And if they fail to do so, then they can be sued by their shareholders, who can take out injunctive relief to stop them abusing their public purpose. Now, there's one part of the economy where I believe that the public benefit corporation is potentially going to be of particular significance in the future. And that is in relation to the commanding heights of our economies. The utilities, the energy companies, the telecom, the transport companies, the water companies, and in banks and companies with significant market power. At present, the only way we've got of aligning the interests of those companies with the public interest is through regulation. And we tie knots around those companies to ensure that they abide by those regulatory rules. But the problem is that the interests of the regulator in upholding the public purpose is exactly in conflict with the private interests of those companies in maximizing shareholder returns. And so the companies do whatever they can to circumvent the regulatory rules, or even better, to turn them to advantage in keeping competitors out of their industries. And that's basically why regulation has in many instances been such a failure. But if we instead say that these companies should be public benefit corporations, where their public benefits, their stated public benefits, should be their license conditions to operate, then instead of there being a conflict between the regulatory purpose and the fiduciary objectives of directors, the two interests become aligned. Now, that's one way in which we can enhance the operation of regulation within economies, but I don't think that we should just expect our corporations to meet those minimum standards as laid down by regulation. Indeed, it's really quite outrageous that the UK and Germany in particular led the way at the beginning of the 19th century in the introduction of social legislation to protect employees in factories through, for example, the Factory Act in Britain, when 200 years later, many corporations get around that legislation by contracting out their activities to parts of the world where there is not equivalent types of social legislation, for example, in the sweatshops in Bangladesh. We should expect our corporations to go further than just abiding by the minimum stated regulatory rules, and the best companies do exactly that. In 1950, John Spaden Lewis set up a trust to hold the shares of the company which he and his father had established. And he set up that trust to act on behalf of the employees in the company. He wanted the trust to continue in perpetuity. But as we discussed a bit earlier on today, in common law countries in particular, there's an aversion against perpetuities and in particular limitations on transfers of control. And the particular limitation on duration that applied in 1950 when this trust was established was that it could not persist for more than 21 years after the death of someone alive at the time. Well, the person who was chosen in the case of this particular trust was the descendant of the then reigning monarch, George V, in Britain. The relevant descendant was Queen Elizabeth II. So that on the death of Queen Elizabeth II, not only will we be mourning the passing of our dear monarch, we will also, 21 years later, be mourning the passing of another British institution, one of the most successful companies in Britain and the most trusted companies in Britain, the John Lewis shops in Britain, which were established according to this trust on behalf of the employees in the companies. And what will happen when Sergey Brin and Larry Page pass from their current state into their solid coffin state? Who then will be looking after the purposes and values of Google? Well, one answer to that is to actually think about these industrial foundations as a way of perpetuating the values of founders of companies to ensure that they are perpetuated into the future. In essence, it provides a different form of philanthropy. The traditional form of philanthropy is that you engage in rape and pillage while you're establishing your successful corporation, and then to seek redemption, you give away your money in the form of foundations. That was basically the story of the robber barons, the Carnegies, the Mellons, the Rockefellers, and the Vanderbilts. But there are two problems with that. It creates a lot of social division during the process of the creation of those companies, and it's also a very inefficient form of establishing wealth for the foundations. It's much more efficient for a foundation to benefit from the income that comes from the companies below it so that it can generate more wealth into the future, and at the same time that foundation can ensure that the corporations below it uphold the purposes and values that were associated with its foundation. So it provides an alternative form of philanthropy and also an alternative form of ownership which is in many respects potentially better than that of having holdings through pension funds or asset management companies or sovereign funds, where the pension funds are beholden to their beneficiaries, the asset management companies to their investors, and the sovereign funds to their political masters. These foundations have as their sole purpose to ensure that the companies below them uphold appropriate values and principles. Now, actually achieving this is relatively straightforward, provided that in a legal and a regulatory context, we recognize the potential benefits associated with having industrial foundations and the sorts of legal structures that in particular in Denmark are associated with it, industrial foundations, or the benefits associated with having public benefit corporation laws, or the benefits associated with having dual-class shares, or indeed, potentially, the benefits associated with allowing perpetuities in some form of trusts. Now, this notion of seeking to address the purpose, ownership, and governance of corporations is of considerable significance and urgency, because there has been a breakdown of trust in the corporation, a breakdown in our belief that it treats employees throughout the organization fairly in terms of relative incomes within the organization, that it treats us as customers, for example, in banks fairly, or that it treats its communities and nations fairly in paying their fair share of taxes. Trust in the context of conventional economic models is just a lubricant for the operation of markets. But in a world in which we face increasing uncertainties, it's fundamentally important to the operation of economies. We need to be able to trust people and institutions not only to tell us the truth, but also to have a real interest in our well-being. The corporation has, in many respects, become increasingly inhumane. And the reason that it's become inhumane is that we're taking humans out of the operation of corporations. Stephen Hawking has reminded us of the risk associated with artificial intelligence making us no longer masters of our own minds, when in a sense that's already happened in relation to the corporation. It's no longer men who are masters of the mindful corporation. It's increasingly going to be markets that are going to be the ultimate masters. And that reflects also the fact that we've taken the humanities out of the social sciences. Adam Smith was very careful to balance the emphasis that he placed on markets in The Wealth of Nations with the emphasis that he placed on morality in A Theory of Moral Sentiment, where we've lost that balance as we've increasingly emphasized the importance of economic efficiency over ethics. Well, I believe that we need to put the humanities back into the social sciences, and we need to put humans back in charge of corporations. And I believe that this is an urgent agenda, because without it, economies will go on collapsing, financial systems will continue to fail, and the environment will continue to degrade. With it, we can achieve higher levels of social as well as economic well-being, because ultimately, a moral corporation is a commercially successful corporation, and the competitiveness of nations depends on the moral fiber of its corporations. Now, I said at the beginning that I think that my father might have appreciated the words that I was speaking, and that my mother might have believed them. Well, I hope that you might lie at least somewhere in between the two. And if you don't, then please do me the favor of violently opposing what I've just said. Thank you very much.
Colin, thank you very much for this intriguing and really thought-provoking presentation, spanning a history of not just a corporation, but also of philosophy and civilization in the past hundreds of years. So I guess there are a lot of questions, and I see already a couple of hands, so let's jump into the discussion. And so let me start. I think we need a microphone. It's over there. Okay, so maybe we start here in the lower rows. Okay.
Will we start here?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting. You kind of listed a few alternatives to reinvent the corporation. And of course, I like the idea of the public benefit corporation working on non-profit banks, for instance, where this kind of multi-purpose organization exists in the realm of banking. And I have to say, it's not limited to just small banks only. So the question, the aspect that you raised at some point, saying that there are limitations to this kind of solutions, organizational solutions, because of the lack of incentives for external investors to actually finance the activities. Well, it's not that a problem for many very large corporate banks, cooperative banks in Europe. But my question was about the foundation solution. I'm a bit skeptical. 25 years ago, Italy passed a law called the Amato Carli law, which basically paved the way for the privatization of the banking sector. And the way they did it was by setting up foundations. Yeah. And they attributed, because one of the problems there at the time wasn't legal problems, was the uncertain legal status of banks. It was not clear, they were not public, they were not private, they didn't have owners. So the first step was to set up new owners, and these owners were the foundations, which were then allocated 100% of the equity. But what happened then was a slow, gradual divestment of those shares by the foundations. And the latest of those large foundations was the foundation owning Monte Paschi di Siena, one of the oldest cooperative or public banks in Europe. And going through different cycles of crisis, this foundation also became a minority shareholder. So my question is, I mean, foundations might be an interesting temporary solution, but the ownership by foundation is not a guarantee that the corporations will radically change. In fact, the foundation actually commodified their shareholdings into those firms. And another example, which is very different from it, will be the trust managing the funding of large private universities in the US. I mean, is it a guarantee that those universities are run in a different way, more sustainable, whatever, than corporations or universities that are not owned by trust or foundations? Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for raising that question, and I'm glad you've raised it. Looking at industrial foundations in Italy is something that I've spent quite a lot of time doing, and it brings out an extremely important point. And that is that the way in which foundations are established is a critical determinant of the performance of those foundations. There are a lot of foundations in Germany as well as in Denmark. In the case of Italy, one of the main reasons why they've been significant failures is that in large part they've been captured by local and regional governments, and they've become politicized. And that has been reflected in particular in the operation of banks along the lines of what you've just been describing. And in fact, I've been involved in some Italian companies that are seeking essentially to establish industrial foundation type structures which avoid the problems associated with the Italian model by looking in particular in incorporating under UK trust law rather than Italian foundation law because of this problem about the politicization of industrial foundations. And in the case, or at least one of the cases where this is happening, I suspect it's going to be as successful as many of the Danish foundations, for the very reason that the structure of that foundation is much more appropriate than that in the case of most Italian foundations. And that's an important distinguishing feature about the Danish foundations from that elsewhere, that in Danish law permits a degree of independence associated with those foundations from government interference. In terms of looking at other trust arrangements, well, again, in many cases, one observes that, for example, associated with the cooperative society in Britain, there were serious failures. And if you pose the question, why did the cooperative bank in Britain collapse? The answer is basically because it attempted to have governance which depended on governance by customers. Well, expecting customers really to take an interest in the running of their organization is not likely to be very productive. And by reforming the governance of that particular organization, it's now beginning to turn around again into becoming a relatively successful organization. Universities are indeed very interesting models. A lot of different trust arrangements. You've referred to the US model. Well, actually, the one that I come from is, in essence, a trust. There are 38 independent trusts established by Royal Charter in Britain, the colleges of Oxford, and all of the colleges in Cambridge are established as independent trusts, and we are all trustees of our colleges. Now, what's a measure of success and failure? Well, I suggested that survival might be. And on that basis, 900 years is perhaps not a bad track record, but it's not proof.
Thanks. I was delighted to hear you mentioning Denmark time and again. If you hadn't, I would have done. I'm a bit frustrated in a way. Is it not true that Denmark is the country with which comes nearest to being dominated economically by firms which are controlled by industrial foundations? But the Danes, not content with that, have provided means for enfranchising their workers if the workers choose,
Yep.
as they may or may not. So that box is ticked as well.
Yep.
And Danish law looks kindly on collaboration among companies.
Yep.
So that box is ticked. And for Brits like you and me, we can observe the Danish economy outpacing the British economy year after year, so that it is now about 50% more productive than our own. What more do we want than the Danish example?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for making that point, and you're quite right that one of the features associated with the dominance of industrial foundations in Denmark has been a remarkably harmonious employee relations in most Danish corporations, and a real sense of cooperation that exists between unions and management in those corporations. And I just reinforce the point that you're making about the comparative performance of Denmark and the UK. Let me just emphasize that the country in the world that comes closest by a fairly large margin in terms of having shareholder primacy or supremacy is the UK. Some people regard the UK and the US as being equivalent Anglo-American models. In fact, the dissimilarities are as great, if not greater, than the similarities. In the US, you can have takeover defenses such as poison pills. In the UK, according to the Takeover Code, you cannot. You can have staggered boards, though those are coming under threat from various quarters in the US. Whereas in Britain, you don't. You can incorporate in states that provide degrees of protection to management, or you can choose to incorporate in states that are essentially shareholder friendly. In Britain, you can't, as I was indicating, have dual class share structures. You couldn't be a Google. You couldn't be a Facebook. You're not allowed to list on the stock market, at least as a premium listed company with a dual class share structure. It's simply not allowed. And the reason for that is that for various political reasons, the dominance of institutional investors in setting the regulatory agenda has been overwhelming, basically since the end of the Second World War period. And the impact of that has been absolutely disastrous on British economic performance. We used, 40, 50 years ago, we had some of the largest manufacturing, chemical industries, electrical industries, electronic industries in the world. They have all gone. We've basically got two large manufacturing companies left in Britain, British Aerospace and Rolls-Royce, and both of those in one way or another are protected by the government through state procurement, or in the case of Rolls-Royce, through a golden share. Otherwise, in the case of Rolls-Royce, it too would have collapsed at the beginning of the 2000s. So if one wants to see an example of where shareholder dominance has really been taken to an extreme, and to pose the question, what has been the impact on performance, you don't have to go much further than the UK. But I'm not going to suggest that one example really proves a point. I'm just emphasizing the fact that the contrast that you've drawn between the performance of Denmark and the UK.
Thank you. Great talk. I'm glad you mentioned Smith, Adam Smith. It's one of the ironies, I think, that free marketeers will look back at Smith, and yet Smith said there was a moral foundation to any market. There's another aspect that when he was talking about the commodity, he said there was two sides to the commodity. There was the exchange side and the use side. And I think, you were talking about the purpose of the corporation. I think one of the problems, possibly, you may comment on this, because you're talking about a paradigm shift. So shifting from what? My suggestion would be from modern economics. And I think the problem with modern economics, unlike Smith, is their foundation is on the rational maximizer. In founding that, the tendency is to move towards the money side to exchange side. That's then incorporated as the shareholder value, for example. So you get a movement of governance that moves the whole of the governance of corporations away from the purpose. And I think one example of that would be banking. In the case of banking, there was only one thing they failed at, and that was banking itself. And if you look at Bajot, Walter Bajot, it kind of illustrates the point. He said, don't trust a banker who stays at work after 3 o'clock. He's particularly talking about limited liability banks. And of course, what he's talking about was a banker who's too enthusiastic after profit, because then what they're doing is selling more and more credit, and we've seen the results of that.
Thank you, and thank you, thank you for raising that point. And I think it is a very important one, and I'm glad you've raised the example of banking, because I think it does illustrate the issue very well. And again, I really want to contrast our experience in the US and the UK with what has actually been one of the most successful banks in Europe over the last 20 or 30 years. It needed no bailing out during the financial crisis. It's one of the highest equity return banks in Europe, and it's the fastest growing bank in terms of branches in the UK. It's the Swedish bank Handelsbanken. And it's a very interesting case, really for three reasons. The first is that it pays its bankers no bonuses. No bonuses, at least, except when they retire at the age of 60, when they get a share of the gains of the pension fund of the business. But remember how we are told that one has to pay bankers bonuses, otherwise one can't recruit decent people. Well, here is a bank that's been perfectly successful at recruiting what seem to be very much more decent people than the average bank without paying them any bonuses. And the second feature of it, which is linked to this point, is it delegates all decision-taking down to individual branches, to the branch managers, to the extent that those branch managers take decisions about which customers they're going to accept, what products they're going to sell in that particular branch. Even the pricing policy can vary across branches, and lending decisions, even up to some of the largest decisions, will at least involve the local branch manager. So when you go into a branch of Handelsbanken, you aren't simply told, well, of course I can't take that decision and you'll have to wait 3 weeks while we refer it up the organization. The branch manager makes the decision and has delegated authority to do that. Now, I emphasize that because, again, remember what is being emphasized as current regulatory best practice, and that is that banks have to set up central risk committees, have chief risk officers, that the boards have to have oversight of all of the risks in the business, and increasingly are going to be liable for losses sustained by the bank. Now, anyone who knows anything about banking knows it's entirely impossible for the bank's board to know about the risks going on in the individual departments and branches of a large multinational bank. And it's a procedure that really is far from diminishing the scale of risks, is likely to cause risks within the bank because of the fact not only is it impossible to monitor in that way, but also if you impose the same rules throughout an organization, then you're actually encouraging a concentration of risks. You're concentrating activities and practices in a particular form. Whereas the Handelsbanken approach is to say, let the individual branch managers take their own decisions according to the underlying clearly defined purposes and values of the bank, which are about sound banking, but where one does not, for the most part, try to centralize risk decision-taking. And the final feature of this bank is its ownership. It's listed on the stock market. It has two large dominant shareholders. One of the dominant shareholders of Handelsbanken is its own pension fund. The second largest shareholder in Handelsbanken is a Swedish investment company called Interdisciplinary. And if you pose the question, who is one of the largest shareholders in Interdisciplinary, you've guessed it. It's Handelsbanken. It's a cross-shareholding. It's precisely what conventional economics and finance would tell you is disastrous governance. And it's one of the most successful banks in Europe.
So this is, you told us about where we ought to get, which is really very attractive, very interesting. Have you any thoughts, Colin, about how we get there? I mean, is your idea that governments might, for example, legislate for industrial foundation type corporations or for the public trust type one with the perpetuity, or the public benefit one rather? I just wonder what exactly is your image, and if it is government, then isn't there a real problem that governments are really fighting it out with the very different sort of transnational corporation that we have, you know, among most of our corporations today.
Okay. All right, thank you for raising the question of what is the path to nirvana. The answer is, for the most part, it is certainly not government. There is one respect in which I think legislation can help, and that is in terms of being enabling, allowing companies to do things. So I think the great feature of US corporate law has been the fact that it has been very inventive, and that the public benefit corporation is essentially the last in the line of a number of innovations that have taken place in enabling different types of structures. And in that regard, I think that the competition between states in the US has been very, very beneficial. Whether or not it gives rise to runs to the top or runs to the bottom, I don't want to debate now, but it has been innovative in that regard. And I think that in Europe we are failing to grasp the real opportunity that exists in that area of having diversity through the natural diversity that exists across member states in Europe. There is more diversity in terms of corporate form in Europe and legislation in Europe than exists in the United States. And we could have a real productive market by which some companies choose to adopt co-determination in Germany, or industrial foundations in Denmark, or to have shareholder primacy in Britain, where they can choose what type of corporate form they want to have, if only the Commission was not so set on harmonization, and harmonization on the UK model. That has been the dominant philosophy behind European policy for several years. So I think that there is a role for legislation in enabling, but for the most part, it has to come about not through government intervention. On the contrary, I don't want the government laying down rules and regulations and certainly prescribing legislative rules, because that gives rise to precisely the problems that I've been talking about in terms of a failure to allow companies to identify appropriate structures. No, what will bring about the change is actually what's going on. And what's going on is that companies are voting with their feet. So in the UK, the number of companies listed on the UK main market has declined from 2,000 to less than 1,000 in 20 years, a halving in the number of listed companies. There's been a similar decline in the US, around about 40% over about the same period. And really what's going on is that companies are saying, we find the influence of stock markets on our activities intolerable, and it's undermining our ability to function properly, so it's better for us to go private and come off the stock market than to remain on stock markets. And that's one of the reasons for the growth in private equity over the last decade or so. Is that a solution to the problem? The answer is no. It's not a solution, because companies do need to raise capital. And to the extent that one wants to have a manufacturing industry, then unlike the mindful corporation, that is dependent on capital raising. And so companies benefit from having access from stock markets. And indeed, if you look around the world at Korea, India, China, stock markets are flourishing. Japan, stock markets are flourishing. The number of companies listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange has gone up dramatically over the last few years. And that's because the feature of companies on those markets is, while they're listed, they are not dominated by those outside shareholders. I've mentioned the fact that Handelsbanken and the industrial foundations are listed on stock markets, and they pay a lot of attention to those stock markets. but they are not under the control of their stock markets. It's the industrial foundations that have controlling interests, or in the case of Handelsbank and its Industriewagen and its pension fund that have controlling interests. So that they benefit from being able to raise capital, and they benefit from having a share price that signals, provides external information on the performance of the company. But they don't have to do what the stock market tells them. And that's the fundamental problem. We need to have long-term shareholders. So if and when those companies that have gone private come back onto the stock market, it should be against the background of an ownership structure that is much more suited to their activities. And what's going to be necessary for that to happen? Well, in the case of the UK, it's going to require deregulation by, for example, the London Stock Exchange to permit things like dual-class shares. But more significantly, it's going to need the emergence of institutions that can take long-term, substantial shareholding positions in companies along the lines of what the foundations and the investment firms in Scandinavia do. And that is where I think we are going to see changes in the future. I don't think that industrial foundations are going to be the only form it's going to take. I think we will observe pension funds realizing that having diversified portfolios has been a mug's game. Okay? It's a zero-sum game to simply hold the index effectively and to trade shares on the basis of index holdings. There is a realization that's beginning to come in that actually you can get the benefit of diversification, but at the same time have some concentrated portfolios in your holdings as well. So those are the pressures for change that are coming about, and it's actually rather interestingly coming from pressures within the corporate sector itself.
Thank you. It's a wonderful presentation and very inspiring. You skipped over a bit in the end, public benefit corporations, and wondered if there's empirical evidence. I haven't read much that would support the profound role that you see them capable of realizing. And the second question is about the foundations. The Bill and Melanie Gates Foundation, one of their principal lines of work is financial inclusion, which is basically a tax-free outsourcing of research and development from Microsoft. So what is the key for setting up foundations so that these conflicts of interest can't arise and the benefits that you see can be realized?
Okay, first of all, in the Public Benefit Corporation, the answer is these are relatively new organizations. To date, they have been relatively small corporations like Patagonia, like Ben & Jerry's, which is now a subsidiary of Unilever. The evidence on their performance is yet to be accumulated, as indeed it is for the B corporations, which is again a relatively recent phenomenon. So what I'm describing in terms of the potential for the public benefit corporation going forward is really thinking of it at a much larger end of operations in terms of significant utilities, where in essence what one is going back to is a model of utilities that used to exist, where in essence they had a public purpose that was built into their license conditions. So, the evidence on whether or not public benefit corporations are going to be outperforming others is yet to be accumulated. The evidence that I was referring to is evidence on the industrial foundation firms. And there has been a lot of work, because those have been in existence for a long period of time, in Denmark in particular, but also in Germany. And there is clear evidence that their performance is at least as good in financial terms as that
of other companies, and they have this feature of a much greater longevity than other corporations. In terms of the conflicts of interest that exists within philanthropy and the ways in which that can be avoided, I think one of the it's quite interesting to look at the structures that some of the more successful organizations have followed. One feature is that to the extent that they have philanthropic activities, then those philanthropic activities can be separated out from the commercial activities. So the Gates model that you're talking about is essentially taking Gates money and putting that money into research purposes, which has actually been extremely beneficial. But one can equally well do it in the form in which the foundations lie alongside the corporations, and they benefit from income that's generated from the corporations, but they are operated independently of the corporations. And that's a different model that says you take the money up from the corporations, and then the foundations that exist above them channel their money to philanthropic purposes. It essentially allows the trust to oversee independently both the foundations and the corporate activities. And that, I think, provides a degree of protection from the sorts of activities that you were talking about.
Okay, so my question is, you claim to be reinventing the corporation. I'd like to challenge you. Are you being inventive enough? So I work with hybrid business models for sustainability, and amongst that comes legal structures such as community interest companies and benefit corporations who try to integrate social and environmental purpose into the basic structure of the corporation. I think there are some extremely challenging dimensions for the practitioners. And right now, those who have chosen this particular legal model, I would describe as highly intrinsically motivated entrepreneurs, who perhaps wish to distinguish themselves from the rest of the pack as a more sustainable brand. So apart from, I think, the challenges on the legislation itself, because I mean, if you look at the legislation in California as opposed to in Delaware, it's far more watered down in Delaware. Like, it's much stronger in California in terms of ensuring social and environmental benefits. I also think there is a very real, these actors are facing some real challenges when competing in the market economy. Are they just, if you look at this from an environmental sustainability point of view, you mentioned Patagonia, you mentioned Ben & Jerry's and all these others. Do you really think they address the environmental challenges that we face sufficiently to be the new sustainable company? Okay. I mean, mass consumption, cost shifting, etc.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for raising that question, because it is a very important one. And my simple answer to you is no, I don't think it's the solution. And really, what I've been emphasizing today is the importance of the large corporation. I have deliberately not been putting my emphasis on entrepreneurship and SMEs, because I believe that in terms of addressing the sorts of issues that you're talking about, the big social and environmental problems of the day, it's in the large corporations that will need to take place. And let me just explain why. In Oxford at the business school, we have a very large activity devoted to social entrepreneurship, the Skoll Centre for Social Entrepreneurship, and it's a very successful centre. And we've just had the annual forum when literally thousands of social entrepreneurs come to Oxford to discuss what they've done. And it's extremely impressive. And as you say, these are highly motivated individuals with a strong sense of purpose and social mission to them. And there's no question that they're doing a lot of good work. But every year, and we've had these things now for, I think, nearly 15 years, every year one basically hears the same underlying problem. It's a problem of, quote, scaling up. How do you move from being a highly motivated social entrepreneur to being a large-scale corporation? And the answer is, it's phenomenally difficult. It's phenomenally difficult because you have to basically be very financially successful to have the ability to scale up. And so while I think that in many respects the social entrepreneurship model is an attractive model, I don't think it is the solution to the problem. I think in many respects a better model is build your successful company as an entrepreneur, but not primarily as a social entrepreneur, and then place the emphasis, as I've been doing in this talk, on the purpose of the larger corporations. And that's what I think many of these most successful companies that I've been talking about essentially have been doing, that they've established enterprise with, which have been very successful. And then in the second, or sometimes the third generation, they said, well, we don't want to pass it on to our heirs. We don't think that they deserve the company. They don't want the company, or they're incapable of running the company. And for whatever reason, they're not going to get it. Instead, we're going to create a foundation to ensure that the purpose is upheld. And I think that that is a more successful model at delivering on social purpose, because it's really at the stage when you become a public corporation, in the sense of moving from a small private limited to a public corporation, that you then have a responsibility that goes beyond just a financial objective. The purpose of a company, when it's got a single entrepreneur, is clearly defined. It's the objective of that entrepreneur. It's when the company becomes a public corporation with a large number of investors that it begins to lose the focus on its purpose. And that's where having the emphasis on social and other issues, I think, becomes particularly important.
We have one last question here to the left.
Thank you for your most enlightening overview. And you mentioned there are 3 dimensions of reinventing the corporation, which is purpose, which you covered, ownership, which you covered. The third one was governance, which you haven't covered. So if you're going to reinvent governance, would you be susceptible to reforming the toxic form of codes that the Cadbury has introduced of conflicts of interest, concentration of power, and dysfunctional form of governance, and consider bringing stakeholders into the governance tent to enrich democracy and provide checks and balances and contestability to excessive power?
Okay, for governance of corporations and the Cadbury Code in relation to them are very important questions that I could talk about at length. Let me just very briefly say that the Cadbury Code, in having a comply or explain principle associated with it, is in many quarters regarded as being a great success, and it's become adopted by many countries around the world. Most recently, actually, by Italy, which is adopting something very close to a Cadbury Code model. But alongside the adoption of the Cadbury Code has been the considerable failures of governance associated with the financial crisis, the continuing collapse of British manufacturing, and the failure of corporations to deliver on their purpose. And I periodically advise the boards of publicly listed companies on their board governance. And one of the things that strikes me about doing those exercises is how futile they are. Because basically what one has is a list of objectives largely emanating out of the Cadbury Code, which are associated with things like appointments, remuneration, disclosure of information, etc., without there being any notion as to whether or not the board is delivering on the purpose of the company. And indeed, as part of those governance reviews, you do not, in general, even pose the question, what is the purpose of the company, and does the board understand the purpose, and what does it take for it to ensure that the purpose is being actually fulfilled? And so when I do these reviews, that's the thing that I do. I start off by saying, what is the purpose of this company? What is it really seeking to achieve? What are its values? And how does the board ensure that those purposes and values are really embedded in the organization? Now, as part of that, it does need to go through this exercise of recognizing the interests of different capitals: human capital, social capital, natural capital, as well as financial capital, and understanding the relative significance of those. And in that respect, one is bringing in the interests of other parties, of other stakeholders. Does one want to have worker representation, co-determination, etc., as part of the governance structure? In some cases, that's appropriate as a way of ensuring that the interests of those stakeholders are upheld. In other cases, it's not the appropriate governance structure. As I emphasized earlier on, one needs to have diversity, but one clearly does not have the right governance arrangements at the moment because the adoption of the rules has been completely misapplied and fails to grasp what the fundamental purpose of the governance of companies should be.
Okay, again, Colin, thank you very much for this enlightening talk. Great discussion. I've learned a lot, and I hope you will come back to Lugano very soon so we can continue on this. Everyone else, I thank you for being here and your great questions, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in Lugano. Have a good evening.
Are they the solution? Not the solution. Very, very much.